The gas lamps glowed faintly along London's cobblestone streets, casting elongated shadows over the damp stones. Carriages rattled by, their iron wheels grinding against the pavement, while women in layered gowns moved carefully, almost ritualistically, as if the very air demanded restraint. This was the world of Victorian England. A world of empire, invention, and rigid social codes, where every movement of a woman was weighed, judged, and measured against rules so strange that, to us today, they feel almost unbelievable. But for the women living in it, etiquette wasn't just formality. It was survival. Eleanor Whitmore was 21 when she first entered the drawing rooms of London's high society. Born to a wealthy industrialist father, she had been trained for years in the delicate dance of manners. She could recite poetry without hesitation, walk with her eyes lowered at precisely the right angle, and drink tea without making the slightest sound against porcelain. Yet beneath the lace gloves and faint perfume, her heart raced with both anticipation and unease. Her mother, Lady Margaret, whispered as they approached their host's parlor that evening. "Remember, Eleanor, never lift your skirts above the ankle when you sit. Never laugh too loudly. And for heaven's sake, do not let the gentlemen see you eat with hunger. A woman's appetite is never to be on display." Eleanor nodded, though part of her wanted to protest. She wasn't hungry in that moment, but she often wondered why even the most natural desires, like the urge to eat or the joy of laughing freely, were treated as unladylike, almost sinful. The parlor smelled of roses and tobacco. Ladies in pastel gowns whispered behind fans, and men in tailored coats spoke of politics and empire. Eleanor took her seat, careful to arrange her skirts in a perfect circle around her. Every move was practiced. Every gesture calculated. She was a young woman in a world where a single misstep could ruin a reputation. And in Victorian society, reputation was everything. One of the strangest rules Eleanor had been taught was never to call directly on a gentleman, nor to address him first in conversation unless formally introduced. To us, it may seem harmless, but in that world, a woman who seemed forward risked being labeled improper. This meant Eleanor spent many evenings in silence, waiting for others to acknowledge her, her thoughts trapped behind a polite smile. She watched now as Lord Ashbury entered the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a reputation for both wealth and cruelty in business. Several mothers immediately steered their daughters into his path, hoping to secure a favorable marriage match. Eleanor's own mother nudged her sharply. "Sit straighter. He notices everything." Eleanor obeyed, though she hated herself for it. Another rule, perhaps the most exhausting, was the demand for constant modesty. A woman could never allow her emotions to spill openly. Tears were to be shed only in private. Anger was considered a moral failing. Even joy had to be restrained, expressed with gentle smiles rather than bursts of laughter. It was a suffocating kind of control, one that left Eleanor yearning for air whenever she was alone. Sometimes she would sneak into her father's library, curl up in a chair, and allow herself to read novels that made her laugh until tears rolled down her cheeks. But never in public. Never where society could see. The oddest, and perhaps most humiliating, of the rules came during dining. Eleanor remembered her first great dinner vividly. The table was heavy with roasted meats, steaming vegetables, and elaborate pastries. But as the youngest unmarried woman present, Eleanor was not to eat until all the senior women had taken their portions. Even then, she was expected to eat sparingly, never reaching twice for the same dish, and always with tiny, delicate bites. The irony? While men could drink until their faces flushed red, women were to maintain an almost ghostly presence, barely tasting the food before them. That night, Eleanor returned home weak with hunger. Yet she dared not complain. Her mother reminded her that appetite was an animal impulse and not suitable for a lady of standing. Still, for all these suffocating codes, Eleanor had an instinct her mother lacked, an inner defiance. She began to notice other women like her, women who quietly resisted these rules. There was Clara Weatherby, who secretly published essays in the newspapers under a male pseudonym. And Julia Montgomery, who scandalized her family by insisting on walking unchaperoned in Hyde Park, daring the stares of strangers. In whispered conversations, exchanged glances, and the subtle courage of these women, Eleanor began to feel less alone. But society had a way of punishing even the smallest rebellion. And Eleanor would soon learn that every choice, every breach of etiquette, could alter the course of her life forever. For now, though, she sat in the candlelit parlor, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while the weight of Victorian rules pressed heavily upon her. Her heart beat with both fear and longing, her spirit caught between obedience and the desire to break free. And as she looked across the room, her eyes briefly meeting those of Lord Ashbury, she knew that her story, in the battle between freedom and etiquette, was only just beginning. The weirdest etiquette rules Victorian women had to follow, Ancient History for Sleep, Part 2. The evening stretched on, filled with the hum of polite conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the rustle of silk skirts. Eleanor Whitmore remained in her chair, hands folded in her lap, her gaze flickering between the faces in the parlor. Though she sat silently, her mind stirred with restlessness. Lord Ashbury's eyes had found hers only briefly, but the weight of that glance lingered. She knew, without words, that he had taken note of her. And in Victorian society, the attention of a man like him could either elevate or destroy a woman. After the gathering, the Whitmore's carriage carried them back to their grand townhouse near Grosvenor Square. The lamps outside flickered in the fog, and the faint sound of hooves echoed across the quiet streets. Her mother, Lady Margaret, adjusted her gloves with sharp movements. "You carried yourself well enough tonight. But I noticed you held your fan at the wrong angle when Lord Ashbury approached. That kind of mistake may seem small, but it speaks volumes." Eleanor wanted to protest, to tell her mother that the rules were impossible to master because they were designed to trap women in endless performance. Instead, she only whispered, "Yes, Mother," and turned her gaze to the window. The night outside felt freer than anything within those suffocating parlors. The next morning, Eleanor was expected to make calls. Another odd ritual, women were to leave small cards with their names neatly printed on them at the homes of acquaintances. These calling cards were an unspoken ledger of social standing. To forget to leave a card, or to fail to return one, was a slight that could ripple through drawing rooms for weeks. Eleanor sat beside her mother in the carriage, a small silver case of cards in her gloved hands. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke drifting from the chimneys. "Remember," Lady Margaret said, "you must never overstay a visit. 15 minutes at most, and no more than 3 biscuits with your tea. A lady who lingers is a lady who imposes." Eleanor nodded, though the thought of measuring out her very presence in minutes and crumbs struck her as absurd. Their first call was to the Montgomerys, a family whose wealth came from shipping. Julia Montgomery, Eleanor's friend, greeted them in the parlor. Julia was a striking young woman with a mischievous glint in her eye, the sort of woman who seemed to test the rules without outright breaking them. As the mothers exchanged compliments and commented on the latest issue of the ladies' magazine, Julia leaned closer to Eleanor and whispered, "Did you hear? Clara Weatherby has been seen at the British Museum without a chaperone. Imagine the scandal." Eleanor's lips parted in surprise. "Alone?" "Yes. Alone," Julia confirmed, eyes sparkling. "She claims she was studying the Rosetta Stone for her writing. But of course, she publishes under a man's name, so no one dares say much. Still, the whispers are everywhere." Eleanor felt a flicker of admiration. To stand in those grand halls unaccompanied was not just bold, it was dangerous. Yet Clara had done it, chasing knowledge in a world that denied women the same freedom men took for granted. Their conversation ended abruptly when Lady Margaret called Eleanor back into the formalities. The rules allowed no private conspiracies between young women when elders were present. That evening, Eleanor returned to her father's library. The fire crackled softly, and rows of leather-bound books lined the shelves, smelling of dust and ink. She opened a volume on ancient Egypt, tracing the illustrations of pharaohs and hieroglyphs. She thought of Clara at the British Museum, standing before the Rosetta Stone, daring society to judge her. The idea stirred something deep within Eleanor, a longing not just for freedom, but for meaning. To live only as an ornament in parlors and dinner halls felt unbearable. As she sat absorbed in her thoughts, her father entered quietly. He was a man of industry, his fortune made in textiles, his manner stern but not unkind. "You spend more time in here than your brothers ever did," he remarked, watching her. Eleanor smiled faintly. "The books do not ask me to sit properly or smile at the right moment. They only tell their stories." Her father chuckled, though his eyes softened with worry. "Careful, my dear. The world outside does not forgive a woman who steps too far from her place." The following week brought a surprise, an invitation to a dinner hosted by Lord Ashbury himself. The envelope arrived on thick cream paper, sealed with a crimson crest. Lady Margaret was ecstatic. "This is it," she said breathlessly. "This is the opportunity we have waited for. Do you understand, Eleanor? To be invited by Lord Ashbury is no small honor." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She had no desire to catch the interest of a man rumored to ruin his competitors without mercy. Yet she knew refusal was not an option. On the night of the dinner, she wore a gown of pale blue silk, her hair arranged in intricate curls. The Whitmore's carriage rolled up the gravel drive of Ashbury Hall, a mansion whose stone walls loomed against the moonlit sky. Inside, chandeliers glittered over tables laden with food. Eleanor moved through the crowd with her mother at her side, offering polite greetings. Her heart beat faster when Lord Ashbury himself approached. He bowed slightly, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly. "I am honored you accepted my invitation." Eleanor curtsied, murmuring the required pleasantries. But as she rose, she felt the weight of his gaze pressing into her, as if he were assessing not just her manners, but her very soul. Dinner was elaborate. Servants moved silently, placing silver dishes before the guests. Eleanor remembered her training: never place elbows on the table, never cut all the meat at once, never speak more than a few sentences unless directly asked. But as she tried to navigate the rules, she noticed something. Across the table, Clara Weatherby sat, her expression calm and unreadable. Eleanor hadn't expected to see her here. Their eyes met, and Clara gave the faintest of nods, as though she carried a secret Eleanor longed to hear. Conversation turned to the Empire's latest endeavors in India and Africa. The men debated trade routes and profits, while the women listened in silence. But then Clara spoke. "Do you not think," she said clearly, "that we speak too often of profit, and too little of the lives disrupted by it?" The table froze. Forks hovered in midair. Lord Ashbury's lips curled in a thin smile. "Miss Weatherby," he said, "such matters are for men of business. It is not suitable for a lady to trouble herself with them." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps not. But history will remember who benefited, and who suffered." Eleanor felt a thrill of admiration, mixed with dread. Clara had broken the unspoken rule: never challenge a man, especially not at his own table. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Lord Ashbury raised his glass. "To progress," he said coldly, and the conversation resumed, though the tension lingered like smoke. Later, when the guests dispersed into smaller groups for music and conversation, Eleanor found herself near Clara. Their mothers were engaged elsewhere, and for once they could speak freely. "You were very brave," Eleanor whispered. Clara's eyes glimmered. "Brave, or foolish? But what is the point of all this etiquette if it prevents us from saying what we truly think?" Eleanor hesitated, then admitted, "I feel the same. Sometimes I wonder if we are all just dolls, dressed and posed for others' amusement." Clara's smile was sad but knowing. "Then perhaps we must decide whether to remain dolls, or to become something more." Before Eleanor could reply, Lord Ashbury appeared beside them. His presence was commanding, his voice low. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "may I have the honor of your company in the garden?" The request was unusual. A private walk could be interpreted as an advance, even a promise. Eleanor's heart raced. She glanced at Clara, who gave her a barely perceptible shake of the head. But all eyes were on her now. To refuse might cause offense. To accept might bind her to something she did not want. Eleanor forced a polite smile. Of course, my lord. The garden was quiet, bathed in moonlight. Roses climbed the stone walls, their scent mingling with the cool night air. Eleanor walked carefully beside him, every step measured. Lord Ashbury studied her with unsettling intensity. "You are unlike the others," he said finally. "Most young ladies chatter nervously or flatter without thought. But you hold something back. A mind, perhaps." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She chose her words carefully. "I believe a lady must always guard her thoughts. It is not always safe to reveal them." His lips curved into a smile that was not entirely kind. "Wise. Very wise. And yet, I find myself curious what lies beneath that composure." They paused near a marble fountain. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the trickle of water. "You would do well," he said softly, "to consider what future you desire. A woman of your standing cannot remain unwed forever. And there are advantages to aligning with the right household." Eleanor felt the chill of his words more than the night air. Was this a proposal in disguise, or merely a warning? She could not tell. Back inside, the music played, a soft waltz drifting through the grand hall. Clara caught Eleanor's eye from across the room, her expression urgent. But before Eleanor could move toward her, Lady Margaret intercepted, her face alight with hope. "Well," her mother whispered. "What did he say? Do you realize what this could mean for you, for us?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She could not speak of the unease gnawing at her. Not yet. For the first time, she understood that her life stood at a crossroads. On one side lay obedience, security, and the suffocating rules of etiquette. On the other lay risk, scandal, and perhaps freedom. And as the music swelled, Eleanor felt that every choice she made from this night onward would change everything. The weirdest etiquette rules Victorian women had to follow, Ancient History for Sleep, Part 3. The waltz still played as Eleanor stood frozen in the glow of Ashbury Hall's chandeliers. Her mother's eyes gleamed with a hunger Eleanor had rarely seen so openly displayed. Lady Margaret was already weaving futures in her mind, futures that placed her daughter as mistress of this mansion, aligned with one of the most influential men in London. But Eleanor's thoughts were far from gilded visions. The echo of Lord Ashbury's voice lingered, unsettling and sharp, reminding her that his interest was not born of affection, but of possession. When the guests began to take their leave, Eleanor remained silent, her arm linked with her mother's as they descended the steps to the waiting carriage. The cool night air pressed against her skin, grounding her. She wanted to speak, to confess her unease, but Lady Margaret was already rehearsing aloud what their neighbors would say when they heard of Ashbury's favor. "You must not falter now," her mother said firmly as the carriage rattled forward. "This is the moment all our sacrifices were meant for. A woman cannot choose as men do, Eleanor. We must take the futures we are offered and shape them as best we can." Eleanor lowered her gaze, her throat tight. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet rebellion stirred. She did not want a future dictated by fear and advantage. But she also knew that open refusal would invite scorn, not just upon herself, but upon her family. The days that followed were filled with subtle changes. Invitations arrived more frequently, with Eleanor's name written in an increasingly bold script. Neighbors paid visits under the guise of casual courtesy, though their glances carried questions sharper than words. Was Lord Ashbury courting her? Had he chosen his bride? The rules of etiquette gave Eleanor little room to maneuver. She was expected to receive his attentions with grace, to let the tide of assumption carry her along until resistance became impossible. Yet her heart resisted all the same. One morning, Eleanor found Clara Weatherby waiting in the Whitmore's parlor. She had come under the pretense of delivering a novel, but her eyes revealed deeper urgency. "Walk with me," Clara whispered as soon as Lady Margaret excused herself to fetch tea. They slipped outside into the pale light of London's foggy morning. The streets smelled faintly of coal smoke, and the sound of carriage wheels echoed in the distance. "You must be careful," Clara said once they were beyond earshot. "Lord Ashbury is powerful, yes, but he is also ruthless. Aligning yourself with him would be no marriage." It would be a cage. Eleanor's breath caught. And what choice do I have? My mother would never allow me to refuse. She believes this is salvation. Clara studied her with steady eyes. There are always choices. But sometimes we must create them ourselves. Her words carried weight Eleanor could not ignore. For the first time, she wondered if defiance, though dangerous, was her only path to freedom. Weeks passed, and Ashbury's courtship grew more apparent. He arrived at their townhouse with lavish bouquets, his carriage gleaming outside like a symbol of inevitability. At dinners, he placed Eleanor at his side, his remarks carrying a quiet authority that suggested ownership more than admiration. Yet Eleanor noticed something else. Whenever Clara was present, Ashbury's gaze hardened, as if he recognized in her a threat to his carefully ordered world. One evening, during a gathering at the Montgomerys, Clara and Eleanor found themselves momentarily apart from the others. The parlor was filled with chatter and the distant notes of a pianoforte, but in the corner by the window, their voices fell into hushed urgency. "Have you heard," Clara asked, "of the reform meetings held in Bloomsbury? Women gather there, writers, thinkers, even a few from Parliament's families. They speak of suffrage, of education, of rights. I've been twice." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "And were you seen?" Clara's lips curved in a faint smile. "Of course. But I would rather be whispered about for daring than be remembered for silence." The thought lingered with Eleanor long after the evening ended. The idea that women could meet, speak openly, and push against the boundaries of etiquette was both thrilling and terrifying. Could she ever summon such courage? Ashbury pressed forward. One afternoon, he called formally on the Whitmores, presenting Eleanor with a book bound in deep green leather. Inside, his name was inscribed on the flyleaf, as if marking ownership. "A woman of intelligence," he said, watching her closely, "ought to have her thoughts guided by worthy voices. Perhaps these essays will sharpen your understanding of the world." Eleanor thanked him politely, though the weight of his gift felt less like generosity and more like a warning. "Think as I permit, learn what I allow." That night, she opened the book by candlelight, only to discover that many of the passages had been underlined in heavy ink. Each mark seemed chosen to reinforce obedience, hierarchy, control. She closed the cover with trembling hands, her heart filled with quiet fury. The turning point arrived at a grand ball hosted by the Duke of Bedford. The ballroom glittered with light, the chandeliers reflected in endless mirrors, the air thick with perfume and expectation. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, chosen by her mother to emphasize purity and refinement. Lord Ashbury stood at her side through much of the evening, introducing her as though she already belonged to him. But as the music swelled and couples turned across the polished floor, Eleanor caught sight of Clara again, standing boldly near the edge of the room, speaking to a small circle of men and women with fire in her eyes. Though her words could not be heard over the orchestra, her posture, her gestures, carried defiance. When Clara's gaze met Eleanor's, it was as though the music faded. The message was silent yet clear: choose. Decide who you are to be. The dance ended, and Ashbury guided Eleanor toward the refreshment table. But before he could speak further, Julia Montgomery intercepted them, her smile wide with mischief. "Eleanor, come, there's something I must show you," Julia said, tugging her gently away. Ashbury's jaw tightened, but he allowed it, perhaps unwilling to cause a scene. Julia led Eleanor through the side corridor of the ballroom, where the din of music softened into the hush of velvet-draped walls. Once they were alone, Julia leaned close, her voice urgent. "You must know," she whispered, "Ashbury has been rumored to ruin not only his rivals in business, but also women who dared deny him. I should not even be saying this, but you must tread carefully." Eleanor's breath came shallow. "And if I cannot tread carefully?" Julia's eyes softened. "Then tread boldly. It is the only way some of us survive." That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake in her bed, the moonlight spilling through lace curtains, replaying Clara's fiery defiance, Julia's whispered warning, and her mother's relentless ambitions. The world of etiquette pressed in around her, a cage disguised as beauty. But beyond its bars, she sensed the possibility of another life, unwritten, uncertain, but her own. The weight of decision bore down on her. She could continue down the path her mother so carefully prepared, bound to Lord Ashbury, her every thought and gesture measured by rules that denied her humanity. Or she could risk everything, stepping into a world that offered freedom but promised scandal. Her heart raced at the thought of the latter. And yet, a spark within her whispered that perhaps scandal was the only road to truth. Morning came with a crisp chill in the air. London bustled outside, the cries of vendors, the clatter of hooves, the steady rhythm of a city alive with industry. Eleanor dressed as expected, but her mind was no longer entirely captive to routine. As her maid laced her corset, Eleanor's thoughts burned with Clara's words, "Decide who you are to be." She descended the grand staircase, her expression calm, her movements graceful. Lady Margaret awaited in the parlor, a letter in her hand, her face alight. "It is as we hoped," her mother said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Lord Ashbury has requested to call this evening. He will speak with your father." "Eleanor, this is it." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. The moment of no return was drawing near. And yet, within her, a clarity emerged. She could not allow her fate to be sealed without her own voice. She looked toward the window, where the morning light broke through the fog. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of resolve, not quiet rebellion, but something fiercer. She could not yet see the path ahead, but she knew she would not walk it bound by rules alone. That evening, as Lord Ashbury's carriage drew near and the Whitmore's household prepared to receive him, Eleanor stood before her mirror. Her reflection gazed back, composed, elegant, perfectly trained in every rule of etiquette. Yet behind her eyes burned something new, determination. Tonight, she would be tested. Tonight, she would begin to choose. And as the knock echoed through the halls, Eleanor knew that whatever happened next would alter the course of her life forever. The weirdest etiquette rules Victorian women had to follow, Ancient History for Sleep, Part 4. The heavy knock on the Whitmore's front door reverberated through the hall, carrying with it a weight that seemed to settle into Eleanor's chest. Servants hurried to open it, their polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. A moment later, Lord Ashbury stepped into the foyer, his presence filling the space like a cold draft. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a black tailcoat and polished boots. His gloved hand rested lightly on a silver-headed cane, though he hardly needed it. His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on Eleanor before turning to her father. "Mr. Whitmore," Ashbury said smoothly, bowing slightly. "I am grateful for your hospitality." Her father returned the greeting with stiff courtesy. Lady Margaret, standing just behind him, glowed with anticipation. Eleanor, however, remained still at the edge of the room, her hands folded tightly in front of her. They gathered in the parlor, where a fire crackled and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Tea was served, but few cups were lifted. The conversation moved slowly at first, remarks about the weather, about the state of trade, about Parliament's latest debates. And then, Ashbury set down his teacup and fixed his gaze on Eleanor's father. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone measured, "I come this evening not for idle talk, but with purpose. Your daughter, Eleanor, has distinguished herself by her grace and composure. It would be my honor to ask for her hand in marriage." Lady Margaret drew in a sharp breath, her eyes shining. Mr. Whitmore's face remained carefully neutral, though his fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair. Eleanor's heart pounded. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like the closing of a door. Her mother spoke quickly, almost breathlessly. "My lord, we are most honored by your request." "Eleanor." But Eleanor's father raised his hand slightly, silencing her. His gaze turned to his daughter. "The matter concerns Eleanor as much as it does us. What say you, child?" All eyes fell upon her. The room seemed to shrink, the air tightening around her. Every lesson of etiquette screamed within her, "Be polite, be agreeable, never contradict a man of higher standing." Yet beneath that weight stirred something stronger. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "My lord, I am humbled by your regard. But marriage is a grave matter, and I would ask time to consider." A flicker passed across Ashbury's face, surprise, perhaps irritation, but he quickly masked it with a thin smile. Of course. Prudence is a virtue. I shall await your answer. Lady Margaret's face tightened in disbelief, but she said nothing, silenced by the presence of both men. The conversation shifted awkwardly to safer topics, but the evening never regained its ease. When Ashbury finally departed, his bow to Eleanor was formal, his eyes unreadable. As soon as the door closed, Lady Margaret turned on Eleanor. How could you hesitate? Do you understand what you risk by such foolishness? Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. I only asked for time. Surely that is not foolish. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. You are playing with fire. Do not think society will wait for you to decide at leisure. Opportunities like this do not come twice. Her father, however, studied her silently. His eyes, though stern, carried a flicker of something else, perhaps recognition of a strength he had not expected. The following days brought whispers. Somehow, word of Ashbury's proposal had spread, and with it, the shocking detail that Eleanor had not immediately accepted. Neighbors arrived with flowers, their polite words hiding sharp curiosity. Servants carried gossip from one household to the next. Eleanor bore it all in silence, though inside her heart churned. Each day, she returned to her father's library, seeking refuge among the books. There, she found solace in histories of women who had lived before her, queens, writers, and reformers whose names endured despite the constraints of their times. One evening, Clara Weatherby slipped into the library to find her. She had come under the guise of a social call, but her eyes told another story. So it has happened, Clara said softly, closing the door behind her. He has asked. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. And you hesitated. Yes. Clara smiled faintly. Then you are braver than most would dare. But bravery, Eleanor, is only the beginning. You must decide whether to endure the path chosen for you, or to carve another. Eleanor looked down at the book in her lap, her voice low. And if I carve another? What then? What becomes of my family, of my reputation? Reputation is a fragile thing, Clara said. But freedom is worth the scandal it demands. The idea gnawed at Eleanor long after Clara left. Freedom. The word shimmered like a vision, bright and dangerous. Could she claim it without losing everything? Her answer began to take shape the next week, when Clara invited her to one of the reform meetings in Bloomsbury. Eleanor hesitated, knowing her mother would never permit it. But at last, under the pretense of visiting Julia Montgomery, she slipped away in a modest cloak, her heart racing with both fear and anticipation. The meeting was held in a small hall above a bookshop, the air thick with the scent of ink and candle wax. Men and women sat together, their voices rising with passion as they spoke of education, of suffrage, of the right for women to stand as equals in the eyes of the law. Eleanor listened, transfixed. Here were voices unbound by etiquette, speaking truths she had scarcely dared whisper even to herself. When Clara stood to speak, her words rang with fire. We are told to sit silently in parlors, to smile and obey, to bind ourselves to futures chosen for us. But history will not remember the women who remained silent. It will remember those who demanded to be heard. The hall erupted in applause. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, her spirit stir. For the first time, she glimpsed a life not dictated by rules and glances, but by her own will. Returning home that night, she felt both exhilarated and terrified. Her mother noticed the flush in her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes, and frowned. You must remember your place, Eleanor, Lady Margaret warned. Your future depends on it. But Eleanor no longer heard her words as she once had. Something within her had shifted. The following week brought another summons from Ashbury. This time, it was not a polite invitation, but a command veiled in courtesy. He requested Eleanor's presence at Ashbury Hall to discuss their future. Lady Margaret pressed her daughter to accept, her hands trembling with urgency. This is it. He will not wait forever. You must not provoke him further. Eleanor agreed outwardly, though her heart rebelled. When the evening came, she dressed carefully, her movements precise. Yet beneath the silks and lace, her resolve hardened. The carriage carried her through London's fog, past gas lamps flickering in the night. Ashbury Hall loomed ahead, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Inside, she was led once more to the grand parlor. Ashbury awaited her, standing by the fire, his expression unreadable. When the door closed behind her, the silence deepened. "Miss Whitmore," he said at last, his voice low, "I have been patient. But patience wears thin. It is time for you to decide." Eleanor's hands tightened at her sides. She felt the weight of every lesson, every warning, pressing upon her. Yet beneath it all was the fire kindled in that Bloomsbury Hall, the memory of Clara's voice, the vision of freedom. She drew in a steady breath and met his gaze. "My lord," she said quietly, "I cannot give the answer you expect." For a moment, the room seemed to still. The crackle of a fire was the only sound. Ashbury's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "You would refuse me?" His words were calm, but beneath them lay a chill that raised the hairs on her neck. "I would choose," Eleanor replied, her voice firmer now. "And choice means I cannot be commanded." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken consequences. But Eleanor did not falter. For the first time, she stood not as a figure molded by etiquette, but as a woman claiming her own voice. The weirdest etiquette rules Victorian women had to follow, ancient history for sleep, finale. The firelight cast long shadows across the parlor walls, flickering against the heavy curtains. Eleanor's words lingered in the silence, sharper than any blade. Ashbury's eyes, once polished with charm, hardened like stone. He stepped closer, his polished boots echoing faintly on the parquet floor. "You would risk everything for the illusion of freedom?" he asked quietly. "Think carefully, Miss Whitmore. Your hesitation has already stirred whispers. A refusal will brand you as reckless. No respectable man will have you." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she did not step back. "Then let it be so. I will not barter myself for security, nor bend to rules that suffocate my spirit." Ashbury studied her a long moment, then let out a cold laugh. "Your defiance is bold now. But boldness fades, and society does not forgive." He turned, his cape flaring as he strode to the door. "When ruin comes, do not say you were not warned." With that, he was gone, leaving the door to close behind him with a final, echoing thud. The days that followed were heavy with consequence. Word spread quickly through London's drawing rooms and parlors: Eleanor Whitmore had refused Lord Ashbury. Shock rippled through the social circles. Some called her foolish, others daring. Invitations dwindled, whispers grew louder. Lady Margaret's cheeks burned each time she entered a room. But not all voices condemned. Among the quieter corners of the city, Eleanor's name began to carry another meaning. Young women, hearing the story in fragments, spoke of her choice as an act of courage. Clara, upon hearing the news, grasped Eleanor's hands tightly. "You have done what many of us only dream," Clara whispered. "You proved it is possible to stand." Still, the cost was real. At home, Lady Margaret despaired, pacing the halls like a restless spirit. "You have doomed us all," she cried one evening. "Ashbury's influence is vast. Your brother's prospects, your father's position, everything is threatened." Eleanor, though shaken, could not bring herself to regret. The vision of Ashbury's smoldering gaze haunted her, but so did the memory of Clara's firelit speeches, of women who demanded to be more than ornaments in parlors. The true reckoning came a week later. A letter arrived, its wax seal dark and deliberate. It bore Ashbury's crest. Eleanor broke it open with trembling hands. "Miss Whitmore," it read, "your refusal has been noted. You have made an enemy of one who does not forget. But mark this, history is written by those with power, not those with ideals. Pray you do not discover the cost of learning otherwise." The words chilled her. It was not merely wounded pride, it was a threat. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her desk. Fear pressed against her resolve, but beneath it burned something deeper: determination. Clara urged her forward. This is no longer just about you. Your defiance has become a story others whisper with hope. You must decide whether to let it die, or to let it grow. So Eleanor began to attend the reform meetings in earnest. Each time, her voice grew steadier. At first she only listened, but soon she spoke, adding her own questions, her own doubts and hopes. The others listened, their eyes bright, their nods firm. She was no longer only Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a merchant. She was a woman daring to shape her own fate. One night, Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. You do not yet see it, Eleanor, but you have become a symbol. Women hear your story and believe more is possible. The confrontation with Ashbury came sooner than expected. At a gathering in Mayfair, he appeared across the ballroom like a storm cloud among chandeliers. Murmurs swept through the crowd as he approached Eleanor, his expression smooth but his eyes burning. Miss Whitmore, he said, bowing with cold precision. I see you have not withered in the silence of disgrace. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. Nor have I surrendered, my lord. I live as I choose. Their exchange drew curious eyes. For a moment, the weight of centuries of etiquette hung between them, obedience on one side, defiance on the other. Ashbury's smile was thin, his words edged with venom. Do not mistake curiosity for respect. London may find your rebellion amusing for now, but it will not last. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, her voice calm. Then let them laugh. Better laughter at my freedom than silence in my cage. Gasps rippled nearby, but Eleanor did not falter. Ashbury's hand tightened on his cane, his jaw set. But he said no more. With a curt bow, he turned away, his departure watched by dozens of eyes. That night, Eleanor lay awake, the confrontation echoing through her mind. Fear lingered, but so did triumph. She had faced him, not with trembling silence, but with words of her own choosing. And in that moment, she had felt something stronger than safety, she had felt power. Months passed. Seasons shifted. Society never fully forgave her, but neither did it destroy her. She existed in a liminal space, half outcast, half inspiration. Her mother never ceased lamenting, but her father, though silent, began to watch her with a quiet pride he did not voice. In Bloomsbury, her work with Clara deepened. They organized lectures, raised funds for schools, and spoke in halls where gaslight flickered on eager faces. Each step carried risk, but each step also carried hope. One evening, after speaking before a crowd of women and men alike, Eleanor stood at the edge of the hall, watching the faces alight with conviction. A thought settled into her like the final note of a song. She had found her place, not in a parlor bound by rules, but in a movement bound by vision. The final test came when Ashbury's shadow returned in another form. A pamphlet appeared in the city, defaming her, mocking her refusal, painting her as unstable and unfit for polite society. Her mother wept when she saw it, fearing complete ruin. But Eleanor only folded the pamphlet and set it aside. Let him write what he will, she said. Words can wound, but they can also awaken. If they speak my name in mockery, at least they speak it. And others will hear, and wonder, and perhaps they will see. And indeed, some did. The pamphlet traveled farther than Ashbury intended. In distant towns, women who had never set foot in London read of Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who refused. And they whispered her name not with scorn, but with admiration. Years later, when Eleanor looked back on those days, she remembered both the fear and the fire. She remembered her mother's desperate warnings, Ashbury's threats, the loneliness of scandal. But above all, she remembered the faces of women who found courage in her defiance. Her choice had not toppled empires, nor rewritten laws overnight. But it had planted something. A seed of rebellion, a spark of possibility. And that, she realized, was how history often began, not with thunder, but with a single, stubborn refusal. Standing at her window, the city sprawling before her, Eleanor smiled faintly. She had lived not as a shadow bound by etiquette, but as a voice breaking free of it. And in that freedom, she found her story had already become part of something greater, the beginning of change.